Hello everyone, welcome to yet another book to game comparison video. Today I am looking at the Nancy Drew game Shadow at the Water's Edge and its respective source material. So that novel that we are going to be looking at is a Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys super mystery called Tour of Danger, and it was published in 1992. And then of course we're going to look at the game Shadow at the Water's Edge, which was released in 2010. So I have a spoiler alert for you guys. I'm going to be telling all the details about both of these stories. And just to forewarn you, this is sort of a tricky comparison to do because the stories are nothing alike. So it's a little tougher to do like a proper comparison. I'm pretty much just recapping two very different stories that happen to both be set in Japan. But let's get to that. So let's start with our novel. So as I already noted, this is a Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys super mystery. So this is from the series from back in the 80s and 90s. And it is the second time that Her Interactive has used one of these books as the inspiration for a game. And this is book number 12 of that series. So it is titled Tour of Danger. And we have a lot happening in this story. So we start off with Nancy and Bess, who are vacationing together in Tokyo, and they're going on a tour. And they wind up stumbling upon a pearl smuggling operation that is based out of their hotel. And that's something that they learn pretty quickly, or at least that is suspected pretty early. They see this woman named Letty. She is getting ready to leave. She's part of a tour, same sort of tour group, but they're heading back to the States. And she has this vase that she unexpectedly drops. And when it smashes, pearls come tumbling out. And a police officer from the CIA, I shouldn't call him a police officer, but an officer from the CIA, so based out of the States, along with some Japanese officers, are there very quickly because they've had this suspicion that this operation has been based out of the hotel. So he sort of acts really swiftly and detains Letty. But Nancy pretty quickly thinks, no, this woman's been set up, so I'm going to dig into this, as she would. So really quickly we get our base for the mystery for Nancy and Bess to work on. And then we have, of course, Frank and Joe Hardy, who are also naturally in Japan at the same time as Nancy. And they're already working on a case. They're there undercover. They're also in Tokyo. And they're working at a place called AMSA Electronics, or AMSA Elite is the specific sub-company. And they're looking into a counterfeiting ring. So the head of operations out of the States, who also spends time in Tokyo, he's a friend of the boy's dad. And he can't trust his employees, so the only people he can trust to look into this are the Hardy brothers. And so they're trying to figure out who is behind the counterfeiting, and they are the counterfeiters, that is, they are swapping some of the internal components. And they've determined that that's happening in Tokyo before the products get to the United States. So that is the mystery for these Hardy Boys to solve. And of course, pretty quickly, Nancy, Bess, Frank, and Joe, they bump into one another, as happens. But we'll get quickly back to Nancy's case. So what she learns fairly quickly into her investigation is that senior travelers, so not young people like herself, but those who are a little bit older and a little bit less suspecting, they're the unsuspecting travelers, they're being used as mules to transport these pearls from Japan to the United States. And for the Hardy brothers, their story sort of involves the Yakuza, which is the Japanese mob, and that they may also be involved in the counterfeit electronics, which makes the whole case a lot more dangerous. So let's jump over to characters. So we have Letty Aldridge, and she sort of is who sets off the case for Nancy and Bess. She's the one who had the vase, which she dropped, broke, pearls came out. So she's the reason Nancy and Bess get involved in this mystery. Then we have Hiro Katayama and Kenji Ueda, and I apologize if I'm butchering the pronunciation of those names. They are both tour guides for Journeys, and that's the company with whom Nancy as well as Letty were traveling with. We have Theo Meredith, who works at a ceramic shop in Kyoto. So the group doesn't just stay in Tokyo, they do go to Kyoto as well. And it's his shop where Nancy finds these vases that contain the pearls. So he is a suspect pretty quickly once he's spotted. And then for the boys' case, we have Jim and Mariko Yamada. So Jim is the head of the American operations, who is the family friend of the Hardys' dad, Fenton. And Mariko is his niece, and she's been brought on to be a trainee at the company in Tokyo. Then we have Tadashi Kimura, who's another trainee, And he and Mariko are trainees in the same department where Joe is set up. So he's interacting with those two fairly often. And Tadashi, he finds a little bit more suspect than Mariko. He quite quickly gets a crush on her and has a hard time viewing her as a suspect, as is Joe's way. And then we also have Isao Matsuda. And again, apologize if I'm totally mispronouncing the name. He is an employee who's working in the department where Frank is. So those two work together, and he's quite a nervous young man. And Frank, at one point, sees him interacting with someone who he quickly determines to be a member of the Yakuza. So we've got a lot going on in this book. And the four sleuths wind up traveling between both Tokyo and Kyoto, but are primarily based in Tokyo. And then they wind up solving their mysteries between the two places. So in Tokyo, Frank tricks their prime suspect, and that happens to be Tadashi Kimura, into vacating the warehouse that the boys find earlier in the story, where they figured out that the counterfeiting switch is taking place. And so he tricks Tadashi into going there early, and they catch him with the aid of police. And then they all go to Kyoto, all four of our young detectives, and they track down the vases again that Nancy had spotted that Theo Meredith is selling. And she winds up confronting him, and she has a bunch of people racing to, she thinks, her aid, and that includes her two tour guides, Hiro and Kenji, and they wind up helping Theo, so they are also involved in the smuggling operation. But luckily, we've got Frank and Joe there as well, Bess, and a few of the other tourists who are with Nancy and Bess's group when they all come to her aid. And that operation gets shut down. So there's our tour of danger story. Like I said, there's a lot going on. We've got two very separate mysteries. At one point, the sleuths think there might be a connection because we can tie the Yakuza to both groups, and that there is a little bit of a crossover, but it's not a strong one. So mostly they're actually working on separate cases. The Hardys from Nancy and Bess. So there we go. There's our book. Now let's look at our game. So this is the Nancy Drew game Shadow at the Water's Edge, and it's number 23 in the series. So Nancy is vacationing at a ryokan in Kyoto, Japan. And Bess and George are also in Kyoto, but they're not staying at the same place she is. And at this traditional inn, Nancy discovers some rather strange and disturbing events. She hears some of the guests complaining, who then leave. Nancy winds up being the only one staying at the ryokan. And then she also bears witness to some strange things as well, like wet footprints in her room, doors slamming in the hallways, strange images and mirrors, really freaky stuff. And she learns that the inn has a reputation for being haunted. And so Nancy's starting to wonder, is this haunting real? Like, this has got to be fake. So she's going to look into what's scaring the guests away and what's actually going on. And in her determination to uncover the truth, she is also delving into a rather tragic family story, which has really torn the owners of the inn and somewhat of an estranged sister apart. So that's a really sad storyline that's also incorporated into this game. So our characters include so this family that we've talked about that's sort of been torn apart. So we have Yumi Shimizu. She's the eldest sibling, and she's sort of left at the ryokan to be her own person, and she runs a bento stand. And we have her younger sister, Miwaku Shimizu, who currently basically runs the ryokan, but she's not in line to do it. The expectation is that her sister Yumi would, because that's the traditional way, would be the eldest sibling. And there's tension there because Miwako would like to be the one to run the inn, and her sister doesn't want that. So they both sort of want the same thing, but their grandmother, Takai, doesn't want to let that come to pass. Tradition is very important to her. So that's what we have next is Takai Nagai. She's their grandmother, and her daughter was the girl's mom, and she passed away. She drowned, which was quite sad, and we learned more about that as noted. And so she's really firm in her beliefs and her ways and her traditions, and that's also creating some tension within the family. And she's also having a hard time letting the death of her daughter go. And then we have the fourth physical character of the game, and that's Rentaro Ehara, or Rentaro. I'm again, pronunciation is a little tricky, particularly when you have some characters pronouncing it one way in the game and then Nancy pronouncing it a different way. So he grew up at the Ryokan. He's known Yumi, Miwako, and Takai since he was little, and he's now dating Miwako. And he is sort of the handyman at the inn, but he doesn't want to stay there. He's much like Yumi in that he has greater aspirations, and he would like to leave. He'd like to explore the world. And then the final character I thought I would note is Savannah Woodham. So she was a ghost hunter, and she looked into the Ryokan some years ago, and she didn't feel comfortable about the place. She knew there was real tragedy there, and so Nancy's often in contact with her, as well as her assistant, Logan, to get more information and to help solve this mystery. So Nancy continues her investigation. This is all like evening snooping because she's busy during the day teaching English, and what she learns, as already noted, is that Kasumi Shimizu, so Yumi and Miwako's mom, Takai's daughter, had drowned, and all of the family members feel responsible for her death for one reason or another. We learn that Yumi discovered her mom drowned, and that's going to leave a mark. Miwako blames herself for having been there and not knowing what had happened, and Takai takes more responsibility for her daughter's death because she faked sick, leaving her daughter to work in an area that she hadn't worked in before, that was very slippery and quite dangerous, and she slipped and she drowned, and so Takai feels like that is all her fault because she should have been the one working and not faking sick, because she didn't want her daughter to be able to go off and visit a pen pal. So all these things where they're all feeling like the blame rests on them. Which is really just a horrible way to have to live. As to the faked hauntings, Rentaro is the perpetrator of these acts, and the purpose of this was really to force Miwako to leave the traditional sort of smaller area of Kyoto and go to the city with him. And he knows the place also just has a lot of bad memories, and it's not a healthy place to be because no one's moving on. So he really wants to get out because of that, as well as for his own sort of selfish reasons of wanting to be in the bigger center. So that is the story of the game Shadow at the Water's Edge. So it's quite a sad story. We've got very scary moments, but there's a lot of tragedy there as well. So with that, I will try to compare. These first three are very easy. The rest is not. So we'll look at our titles. They are completely different. So the book is Tour of Danger, and the game is Shadow at the Water's Edge. And I guess they're fitting for each of their stories. So with Tour of Danger, we do have Nancy and Bess, who are meant to be on a tour based out of Tokyo. And they do encounter some rather dangerous scenarios, as do the Hardy Boys, who are not exactly touring around, they're there undercover. But I guess the title works. It could maybe be a bit more expressive of the storyline, but that'll do. Those are just the way of the titles of the super mysteries. And the game Shadow at the Water's Edge, I remember when this title was released, I thought it just sounds very different from the other games. Almost more mysterious in a way. And there's some depth to this title. So when we think about the Water's Edge, we think about Kasumi and how she died. She drowned. And there's the shadow that's lingering over the family and the ryokan of blame and hopelessness. So it's less direct, or it doesn't state outright what type of mystery we're looking into. It's more nuanced than that, I guess is a good way to put that. So 2 very different titles for 2 very different stories, and both suitable. Then our storylines, again, so different. For the book, Nancy is investigating pearl smuggling while the Hardy Boys are cracking down a counterfeiting case. In the game, Nancy's investigating these supposed hauntings at a ryokan. So absolutely zero overlap in any of those storylines. And then our locations are actually basically the same. So for the book, it's actually primarily Tokyo, but there is some time spent in Kyoto. Either way, both in Japan. The game is only in Kyoto, so we do have the overlap a little bit. But otherwise, the same country. That's the same. Now for the trickiest part. So I normally compare characters, and how I would do this is note the character from the book and the game and see what's the same and what's different. And this isn't the first time where this has been a difficulty and where there isn't any overlap. Sometimes there's at least one character. The previous game, not Secrets Can Kill Remastered, but Trail of the Twister, that was the case. I had about one character where there was some overlap. We don't have any of that with these stories. They really are totally unique tales, which makes this not like a proper comparison. So I'm just basically going over the characters a little bit to teach you guys about them if you don't feel like reading the book or playing the game. So, and I always start with the book and then move to the game characters. So let's start with Letty. So she's only in the book. We don't have a game counterpart for her. And so she was a senior tourist, and she was used as a mule by pearl smugglers. So she'd bought this vase with a false bottom that contained pearls. So she was unaware of this, but she was sold a very particular vase because the smugglers thought, authority figures are not going to, or like police authority figures are not going to be questioning this elderly woman with a vase. But she inadvertently drops the vase just before leaving the hotel, before she's departing, heading back to the States. And that releases the pearl, and then, of course, releases this mystery, because Nancy sees this unfold, and she decides to investigate. So that's why I've made note of Miss Letty here. Even though she doesn't actually play a central role in the book, we only see her a few times, but she is sort of the instigating factor for Nancy. Next, I'll look at both Hiro and Kenji together, because they are both tour guides. And again, they're only in the book, and they're tour guides for the company Journeys, who Letty traveled with, as well as Nancy and Bess on their tour. And these two young men, along with some others, have set up this pearl smuggling operation, and they're using the hotel as their base of operations. And they've sort of clued into the fact that senior holidayers are sort of the best transporters of these goods because they're not so suspicious. Whereas anyone going through customs, if you're sort of younger, you're more likely to be searched, is sort of their thought. Whether or not this is true, maybe back in the 90s it was. I don't know if it is now or ever was. I don't know if that would fly these days. And then we're also going to look at Theo, again, just in the book. He does not have a game counterpart. He is the owner of the ceramic shop in Kyoto, where these vases are being sold to tourists. And he sells two different types of vases, but they look the same. We have these normal ones, which is what he sells to most ages of visitors. And then he has the ones with false bottoms that have pearls in them, and these are the ones he sells to the seniors. And they're kept in different places of the store. And Nancy and Bess are kind of sneaky, and they wind up buying one of each. And but he knows that he can't trust these girls, and he has it set up so the vases are stolen from the girls' ryokan, where they have set them. They thought in a safe place, but Theo decides that he's going to take them away from the girls either way. So those are the main characters for the mystery that Nancy and Bess are working on. So now we'll look at the characters who are also only in the book, but who are related to the story that Frank and Joe are working on. So we'll start with Jim, book only, no game counterpart. He's the head of American operations for AMSA Electronics, and he's a friend of Fenton Hardy, so it's the boy's dad, and asks Fenton's boys to go undercover in Tokyo, where his products' components are being swapped for counterfeit pieces. So he's the one who asks the boys to come on board. And then we have his niece, Mariko, and she's brought to Tokyo as a trainee at her uncle's company. So she's played a very similar role to Joe because they're in the same part of the company. Frank is elsewhere. And one day she takes a copy of a schematic that she finds on Tadashi's desk. And so this sort of sets off questions for Joe of, did she knowingly take the schematic, and why did she take it? Was it an accident like she initially claimed? And why is she not being so forthcoming about what happened there? And Joe starts to question her behavior, but also has a hard time because she's very pretty and he falls for her. And what we sort of learn with Mariko is that she's had some trouble, and she didn't want to be at the company. She wanted to go back to the States, but as soon as she saw the schematic, she knew something wasn't right. And so she's actually trying to help her uncle, but she doesn't want to be truthful with Joe because she doesn't know Joe. She doesn't know he's an undercover teen detective. So she actually is trying to be helpful, but her obstinance is a bit of an obstacle for Frank and Joe. Next, we'll look at Tadashi. So he's another trainee at AMSA, and he's the one who had the schematics on his desk that Mariko took. And Joe also happens to see him accessing component information for these game cartridges that no one should have access to, least of all a trainee. So that really puts Tadashi high on his suspect list. And later on, the group is on a company hike, and he sets up a fall. Joe is pushed off this mountain. And Tadashi also sets up the theft of Mariko's bag that has the schematic in it. So what winds up, of course, being learned is that Tadashi, along with others, not necessarily at the company, but other people he knows, are the ones behind the counterfeit switch. And then our last character that we're going to look at from the book is Isao. He's a very nervous employee who works in the department where Frank is. So they're like checking inventory, making sure the right things are being shipped off. And Frank doesn't know, why is this guy so nervous and so quiet? And at one point, Isao is spotted with a member of the Yakuza. And this is determined just based on the tip of a finger being missing. So they're wondering, what's his involvement? Could Isao be behind the counterfeiting? Is he involved with that? And it turns out he's actually just a cousin of this person who happens to be in the Yakuza. But he is selling some of his stolen goods for him. So he's not perfectly clean, but he's also not really involved in the high stakes criminal activity. Let's put it that way. So moving on from book characters, we can now look at the game characters, who we'll also see are not related to any of the book characters. So we'll start with Yumi, so the older sibling of the Shimizu sisters. She really keeps her distance from the ryokan, and she runs a bento stand in downtown Kyoto. And as noted before, she's the one who found her drowned mother some years before. And there's a lot of tension, particularly between her and her younger sister. So her younger sister is Miwako, and she works at the ryokan with her grandmother, and she loves working there. She wants to be based there. And she really resents Yumi for not being present, for having run away and not being a good older sister anymore. And also resents her, I think, because the expectation is that Yumi is going to take her job, because that's tradition. But Miwako wants to be the one at the end. So there's that tension between the siblings. Then their grandmother is Takai, and she, as noted, is very traditional, and she also blames herself for the death of her daughter, Kasumi. Because, again, as already stated, she faked sick and made her daughter do a job she didn't know how to do, didn't know how to be safe, which, in some ways led to her death. And so she has a very hard time of letting go of Kasumi, but also of her granddaughters following their own paths. She's not used to breaking with tradition and following her daughter's wishes. And then our final game character is Rentaro. He is the boyfriend to Miwako, and he's the handyman at the inn. And he so desperately wants to leave that rural countryside and move to the big city. That's where all the life is, and that's where everything's exciting and kind of crazy, and that's the world he wants to be a part of. And so in his desperation, he fakes these hauntings at the ryokan to force Miwako's hand and move away from him, or move away with him. But in the end, makes her move away from him. Because his actions have been so detrimental. So moving on from characters, just a few last notes. A few things that I thought, I can make this comparison. There are a few ties to very small elements. So we do have a ryokan that comes up in both stories. So in the book, Nancy and Bess stay at a ryokan while they're in Kyoto. And that's something that Bess really wanted when they arrive in Tokyo. She's rather disappointed by their rather Western-style hotel room, and Nancy makes a note of, well, a more traditional inn would be a ryokan, and so the idea of going to Kyoto was sort of for the purpose of staying at a ryokan. And then, of course, in the game, that's where Nancy is the entire time, is at a ryokan. So the bullet train I thought I'd make note of too, because that's the mode of transportation in both stories. So Nancy and her tour group, they're traveling by bullet train while on their tour, and also when Nancy and Bess head off to Kyoto. And in the game, of course, that's how Nancy's getting to all these different locations. So when she's going to Yumi's bento stand, when she's going to Yumi's apartment, to the pachinko parlor, and so on, that's via bullet train. Another tiny little crossover, and I was actually impressed with this, was torn door paper. That sounds really weird, but I'll explain it. So in the book, there's a rice paper sort of on the door in the ryokan. Just so it's not like a wooden door. It's rice paper in frames, and it winds up being slashed by an intruder. So it's all torn up. And we actually have a counterpart to that in the game. So when Nancy's opening her balcony door, when she first sees this ghostly figure on the balcony, the door being opened so quickly tears the rice paper on it. So we do have this little tiny bit of crossover, and I don't know if that was intentional or not on the part of Her Interactive, but I hope it was, because I thought that was great. It's a very small thing I can compare and say that's the same. It's not just Japan, but torn rice paper on the door. So we've got that. And the last thing is the incorporation of technology into the story. So going to the Hardy Boys and their investigation, their case is all about electronics and counterfeit components. We don't have counterfeiting happening in the game. However, George is attending this Technology for Tomorrow conference, which is all about technology. So we have that crossover. There's also the robotic cat, Suki, and the uses of technology throughout the game, like Rentaro having the remote control and EVP recording. So we do have technology, and I do wonder, was that because it's mentioned in the book, or would that have just naturally been a part of the story regardless? Either way, we do have that small crossover. And then from here, I would normally talk about the endings. I'm not going to, because they're all so different. There's no point, because I can't compare, because the storylines are different. So I'm actually just going to move straight to my conclusion. So Her Interactive's 2000 game shared really just one small main detail with its 1992 novel, and that is the location. Japan. Kyoto a little bit. But other than that, the two stories are completely different. And I almost want to say three stories, because the Hardy Boys case is so different from Nancy and Bess's case in the book. So speaking of which, the novel, it focuses on smuggling and counterfeiting. And these are not mentioned, these activities are not mentioned in the game, nor are the articles that they're associated with. Pearls and electronics. Despite what I just said about technology being in the game, it's, VCRs and this old technology that doesn't exist in game cartridges. That type of technology is not in the game. And then the game itself focuses on hauntings, of which there's none present in the book. We also don't have any contact with the Hardy Boys in the game, which is kind of weird, because they are a key part of the book. It's sort of funny that we don't get to call them. And I have to wonder, is this because we couldn't make avatars for them that looked like boys? I don't know. But they're not present, despite their very important role in the source material. So more of an opinion thing, Shadow at the Water's Edge, I think has a very good storyline. And it's delivered really well, like the way that they've incorporated the haunting into the story, and sort of some traditional spooky things having to do with Japan. But I think it would have been really interesting if Her Interactive had chosen to explore the world of pearls. And I like the idea of a smuggling storyline, because we don't see a lot of that. We've had a few sort of haunty, spooky things before. So I would have loved to have seen a plot involving the illegal trafficking of pearls. I think that it is a missed opportunity. Even though I really enjoy this game, I would have loved to have seen a different storyline. So that concludes my book-to-game comparison for Shadow at the Water's Edge with its source material, Tour of Danger. Yeah, so like I said, they're completely different stories. There's not really any overlap. The exception really is that they both take place in Japan. But what the plots are not the same. Counterfeit electronic components, pearl smuggling, hauntings, no connection. So this is one of those cases where Her Interactive really loosely base their game off of a book, and we're going to continue to see more and more of that as we progress through the games and books. And I do always find that really disappointing, because I think the stories are so interesting. And there's the odd case where I've said, no, thank goodness Her Interactive changed the storyline. Curse of Blackmore Manor, I think, is a really good example of that. Shadow at the Water's Edge, they made a really great game, but as noted just a moment ago, I would have loved to have seen a storyline about pearl smuggling. And I mean, this is a difficult book because it has two different mysteries that I don't think overlap very well. And I think her interactive would have had to choose one or the other mystery, Nancy and Bess's with pearl smuggling or the boys with counterfeiting. I think the pearl smuggling would have been the one to choose because I have no interest in the electronic counterfeiting bit, and I think that just would have been too complicated and not nearly as interesting. The pearls, I think, is a good association with Japan, so that it would have been a neat opportunity to learn about that and just traditional things more about Japan as a country as well. Not to say that we didn't learn anything about Japan in Shadow at the Water's Edge. It's just a different type of learning that we got, different subject matter. So yeah, so very interesting to try to do this comparison because you can't really, but good stories nonetheless. So even though the book is completely different from the game, I do think it's a good read and do recommend it. I, for the most part, love the super mysteries. I think they're really good, and I think the incorporation of the Hardy Boys actually works really well with Nancy. Like their overlap and teamwork, I think, is really good. So there we go. Thanks so much, everyone, for watching this comparison video for Shadow at the Water's Edge. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to doing the next one. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.